Okay, thank you all for joining us today. We're going to do a 1 hour speech on the H-1B visa and talk briefly about the visa itself. This is perhaps an untimely time to do a lecture on an H-1B because we're nearing the end of the time to prepare for an H-1B for the coming fiscal year. We will have H-1Bs available again after this fiscal year in about a year's time in April of 2017. Until that time, and if you're still contemplating applying for an H-1B this year, um, you probably have maybe a week or so before you really need to, well, before I guess you have a deadline. You have to apply for it by April 1st of this year. And unfortunately, April 1st is right around the corner. And obviously, there's a need for preparation. So basically, we're at sort of at the last minute here. So I guess whoever's coming maybe is thinking about H-1Bs for next year, or maybe you're contemplating one, or you have one, or maybe you're in a different situation. So, first of all, just to go over what an H-1B is for those who may not be familiar with the visa. An H-1B is a non-immigrant visa. Non-immigrant is someone who's not living permanently in the United States. It's used by someone who's going to be employed temporarily in a specialty occupation. A specialty occupation we're going to talk about in a minute, and I'll explain to you what that is. Um, Generally, an H-1B worker can stay and work in the United States for a specific employer. So, in order to be an H-1B worker, you have to have a sponsor to work in the United States. And that sponsor has to employ you as an employee in the United States. Um, there are several conditions that need to be met by the employer in order to obtain H-1B status. Um, I will discuss those also in detail in a minute. One of the main things that seems to come up over and over again over the years is what's called the prevailing wage determination. So if someone wants to obtain an H-1B, they need to be paid a wage that is consistent with the job that they're going to be doing in the area of employment, consistent with other U.S. workers making the same or or more. Um, and there's specific ways of determining what that wage is through usually what people mostly do is use what's called the OES wage survey, and that actually can be found online. Anyone can do it. If you Google OES wage survey, you'll be able to find that information online, and then you can sort of plug in where the job is as well as the job title, and you get an idea of what the salary has to be. Um, for people that are on optional practical training, there are ways of uh, staying in the United States and continuing to work while you're waiting to hear from the government with respect to your H-1B. H-1Bs are costly. They cost quite a bit of money. Not only the legal fee that you will probably pay an attorney or a company will pay an attorney, but the government charges upwards of almost $2,500 for each H-1B if you include all of the filing fees and other costs that are associated with the H-1B. The big problem with the H-1B is in this little blue box here on the presentation. There are only 65,000 H-1Bs for bachelor degree graduates, and there are 20,000 H-1Bs for U.S. master's degree graduates. I just want to say one more time, U.S. United States master's degree would go in that 20,000. So if you have a U.S. master's degree, you get to sort of be put into these two lotteries, because generally what has happened and what will surely happen this year again is that there will be many more applicants than there will be spots for the H-1B. Last year there were 233,000 people that applied for an H-1B with only 85,000 slots available. So a graduate with a bachelor's degree only had about a 30% chance of actually being able to have their application adjudicated. It doesn't mean that if they're chosen, they're necessarily going to get an H-1B. It just means that they're going to have the chance to get their application adjudicated by the USCIS, and then, obviously, if they're approved, they'll have an H-1B. So, assuming that you do get adjudicated and that you get an H-1B, um, you have to first prove that the H-1B that you qualify for the H-1B. Um, and so, what's really important, and a lot of people, may or may not realize, is that the H-1B is only for those who are going to be employed in a specialty occupation. Okay, a specialty occupation is an occupation that requires at least a bachelor's degree, at least a bachelor's degree. Okay, so I have a list here of what would be considered specialty occupations. Um, we have here a list that we took from several years of applications from our firm, with just different positions. Just as an interesting tidbit to know, approximately 80%, maybe even more, of all H-1Bs are IT computer related positions, computer systems engineers, any kind of software engineer, uh, positions of that nature. The second one is probably for an accountant. So if you take IT positions and accountants, you probably have about 90% of all H-1Bs that are applied for. So that really gives you an idea of where the H-1Bs are going. That being said, it's not a visa that is limited to those positions. As you can see from our list, we have sales engineers, graphic designers, textile designers, architects, marketing people, HR people. So you really can have a large array of positions that one could apply for in an H-1B. Again, the important thing to remember about an H-1B is that the, the position must require at least a bachelor's degree. If it's a position like, I don't know, a waiter in a restaurant, for example, that generally will not require a degree. So even if a person came to you and said, I have a degree in hospitality management, I will be a great waiter, an H-1B for that type of position would never work, because a position of waiter does not require a bachelor's degree. Um, and I will talk about briefly, there are ways of getting what's called equivalent of bachelor's degrees. If you don't have a bachelor's degree, you can combine experience that you may have prior to taking your job, and getting what's called the equivalent of a bachelor's degree. So you can get around that criteria. An H-1B is generally good for 3 years. You can extend the H-1B for an additional 3 years. You can stay a maximum of 6 years, but there is a very big exception to this rule, and that is, and this is just for future reference, but you might as well know this, if you apply for a green card, which we call in immigration law a permanent resident card. If you apply for that at least 1 year prior to the the maximum period of stay of 6 years, so within your fifth year of H-1B status, if you apply for a green card, and it's been pending for more than a year, so like before the 6 year period is up, you can extend your H-1B in 1 year periods until such time as your green card is adjudicated. For some people, if they start their H-1B in advance, and these days green cards are going pretty quickly, it's not necessary. But certain people, if, for example, you're from India and you have a bachelor's degree and you're applying for a green card, it could take 8, 9 years to get a green card. So having this provision can be very important to those people. Going back to the minimum salary, for an H-1B, one needs to have uh, be paid the minimum salary. Here on the slide, I have the website listed here, the FLCdatacenter.com. That website actually will take you to the web and you can actually check a salary on that website. Maybe I'll even take the time now to um, show you guys what exactly that website is. So let me just do that for a minute. Sometimes I have time to do this, but let me show you on the web exactly what it looks like. So here's a search. So you open up the search wizard and you choose the state where the job would be located first. You continue. Then you're going to go to the county. And here, let's assume that it's in New York City, so it would be New York County. And let's assume that we're looking for a graphic designer. So we stick in graphic designer here, and we get, lo and behold, a graphic design wage. So if we want to look at that wage, first you can see what the position entails, which is design or create graphics to meet specific commercial, promotional needs, etc. So that's like a normal graphic design position. And then you're going to click on this, and you're going to see a wage come up. And you see like these levels of wages. There's level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. Generally, for an entry-level position, you're going to be looking at level 1. So for someone who wants to be a graphic designer in New York City, the level 1 wage is at least $38,522 a year, or $18.52 an hour if it's a part-time job. And let me mention, part-time H-1Bs are allowed. So you could have a position as a part-time worker as well. So if you're interested in finding, if you have a position and a sort of a potential job, you could always use this to sort of determine what kind of wage the employer would have to pay in order to obtain an H-1B. And that's what this is about right here, basically. Okay, going forward again, the annual limit, I did mention this already, but I would like to go in a little bit more detail here. It is 65,000 for bachelor's degree holders, 20,000 for masters. If you are a master's degree, U.S. master's degree holder, then you got to get 2 shots at this. One shot is in the 20,000 category, and if you're not chosen, you're put into the 65,000 category. So you have like double the chance of someone who is a bachelor's degree holder. That doesn't mean you're going to get it, but it probably brings it from 30% to maybe 40 something percent that you're going to actually be chosen for the H-1B cap. One thing that's important to know, that there are certain instances where you don't have to think about the cap, where you're actually cap exempt. These are in situations where the H-1B holder is seeking an extension or modification. If you already have been selected for an H-1B in the past, we have people sometimes who have had an H-1B. And if you had an H-1B within the last 6 years and you didn't use all 6 years of the H-1B, you can actually recapture the part of the H-1B that wasn't used. And that's a great thing because you don't have to worry about the cap. You can apply anytime as long as you've had one in the past and you haven't used those 6 years. And it has to be within the past 6 years. Also, if you're working for a nonprofit organization that is affiliated with an institution of higher education, okay, or if it's an institution of higher education you are statutorily exempt. So you can get an H-1B anytime. I just want to say again, though, just a nonprofit does not make a person exempt. If they are working for a nonprofit that is closely affiliated with an institution of higher education, or obviously if it is an institution of higher education. Um, so if you've gotten through this kind of annual limit and gotten through all of the hurdles to get there, then you have to deal with uh, what's called RFEs, and those are what are called requests for evidence. And if you get a request for evidence from the USCIS after your case is accepted, then you have to respond to that. And right now, um, the request for evidence is like almost a third or a fourth of all H-1Bs are sent requests for evidence. 26%, I think, in fiscal year 2011. I don't have, unfortunately, more recent statistics, but that was a couple of years back when they've stayed about the same or even gone up a little bit. So, basically, uh, there's a good chance that you'll get one. What that means basically is the government has additional questions on the case. The usual question is, please prove to us that this is a specialty occupation or that your company needs someone of specialty occupation caliber. So that's something that you need to be aware of as well. So it's really important to have everything in perfect order when you're thinking about applying for an H-1B. It's really important to have your documents your position well documented, as well as all the documents that are required in order so that you avoid getting that RFE. Um, Sometimes you can't avoid it, but at least you want to try. Um, I said this in the beginning. The deadline for applying for the H-1B, again, this year is April 1st, 2016. For next year, it will be April 1st, 2017. Basically, what that means is you're applying for an H-1B 6 months in advance of the actual H-1B being available. So an application filed on April 1st, 2016 would be for a start date of October 1st, 2016. So it's better to prepare ASAP. Um, if you have uh, OPT, you can basically work during the time your OPT is valid, obviously, and then after the OPT is expires, as long as you have filed an H-1B application uh, prior to the expiration of your OPT. So let me say that again. If you have OPT and it's good until at least April 1st, the rule is that as long as you apply before it expires, you can continue to work in your position while you're waiting for your H-1B. Once you have an answer from your H-1B, say your H-1B isn't chosen, in that case, your your permission to work ceases to exist, and then you go back to whatever you have on your OPT. So if your OPT is still in effect and still valid, when you hear from USCIS with respect to the the with respect to whether your application is accepted, you can stay until the end of that OPT. If your OPT has expired, but you're in the grace period, and there's a 60-day grace period after the OPT expired to stay in the United States, and say your OPT expired, but you're in the grace period when 4-1 rolls around and you apply for that H-1B. In that case, the rule is that you can stay in the United States, but you can't work. You cannot work during that time. Um, Once the filing has been made, the cap gap extension begins, and it continues until the process has been completed. Again, until you receive an answer from USCIS. If you get the H-1B, of course, you can stay and work until the H-1B becomes valid, which in most cases would be on October 1st. This only applies, by the way, for F1 students. Um, if you are in that situation, you need to go to your designated school officer, and an amendment will be made to the CVIS form. And on the CVIS form, they will issue on your I-20. They will issue a cap I-20 showing an extension of your OPT status until 9/30. That's something that the school would be able to take care of if you show that you have filed for the H-1B. So if you are filing for an H-1B and you want to use the cap gap, make sure that you tell the school. The next slide sort of brings us through to sort of an illustration. In this particular illustration, in this hypothesis, the H-1B was filed on 4/1. The OPT is good until May 31st, and the end of the grace period would be on 7/30. So the employment date starts on 10/1. What happens here is you would be able to stay in the United States all the way through until the start date because you filed before your OPT is expired. You can continue to work, and the assumption here is that the H-1B would be accepted by the USCIS. So a couple of things that I wanted to mention to you guys with respect to some rules that exist with regards to the H-1B. This is going back about 6 years, but one of the things that's important in the H-1B, if you do happen to obtain one, is that there be a valid employer-employee relationship for the H-1B, meaning that I kind of skipped over here a little bit here. Meaning that you have to have a valid employer-employee relationship. Number one, you need to have traditional employment. That's what most people have. You go to an office, you work inside the office, your employer basically controls your work. That's that. If you have temporary or an occasional offsite employment, that's okay too. If you have long-time permanent offsite employment, that's okay too. But the employer, the person who is applying for that visa, has to have control of what you're doing. So that's really important just to remember that that's one of the rules. One of the things that you can't do, you can't be self-employed. So some people in the past, and we've actually helped people with this in the past before 2010, would start their own companies and want to get an H-1B. Well, actually, you can still do that, but you can't be the sole owner of it. If you start your company and you have other people involved in the company, if you have perhaps an independent board of directors, there are ways of obtaining an H-1B and fulfilling the criteria of the employee-employer relationship. But they are difficult cases. And the general rule is that if it's like your own company, you're considered self-employed, and that is not acceptable under the H-1B rules. The other thing that is not acceptable are independent contractors. For example, if you have someone who's paying you on a 1099, someone who is not paying you as an employee, that is not allowed. You have to be an employee of the company in order to obtain an H-1B. Number three, third-party placement job shops. So if you have like a placement agency that says, we'll sponsor you for the H-1B, go work at this employer, we'll pay your salary. Can't do that. The employer has to have control over the employee for in an H-1B scenario. Okay, so I want to go over filing fees, what it costs for an H-1B. And I spoke about this earlier, but this sort of illustrates what it costs. You have the base filing fee, $325. You have what's called a training fee for cap subject positions. If your employer has less than 25 employees, it's $750. And if you have more than 26 employees in the company, it's 1,500. The next one is the fraud, what we call the fraud fee. The fraud prevention and detection fee is $500, and that must be paid by uh, the employer or the employee sometimes, but should be paid by the employer. The premium processing fee, that's an optional fee. If you want to receive an answer in 15 days on your case, you can pay an extra $1,225 to receive an answer. It does not improve your chances of being chosen, and it doesn't necessarily speed up. It doesn't speed up the validity of the H-1B because no matter what, that H-1B isn't starting until 10/1. All it does is you'll get an answer before if you're looking for an answer on a expedited basis. So whether it's worth it to pay $1,225 is really it depends really on the employer and on why you want to pay that extra money. But again, it does not help you become selected. It merely helps you get an answer more quickly if that's what you require. Who has to pay? Who has to pay for the H-1B? Um, the U.S. and this is so we tell our clients in general that the employer should pay for all costs associated with the H-1B, including the attorney's fee. The actual rule is a bit conflictual. Why? Because USCIS requires that the employers pay training fees. Remember, I talked about this training fee up here in this slide, the $750 or the $1,500. Clearly, the employer has to pay that training fee. The DOL requires that all fees be paid except for premium processing by the employer. The DOL doesn't really have jurisdiction over H-1Bs except in the case where they do an audit. So if they come and they do an audit of your company, they can assess what like penalties and back pay wages to the employer if the employer makes the employee pay. USCIS does not have that policy. The better policy, obviously, to be in full compliance is to have the employer pay for all costs associated with obtaining an H-1B. But of course, it's up to the employer, and I must admit that we do have a fair number of employers that do not pay and that have the employee undertake that payment. This is a little bit going ahead of myself, but I do like to mention this now in these seminars. There was a case almost a year ago that requires filing of an amendment. So this is, I'm just going to go very quickly, just in the back of your mind, if you have an H-1B and you change a place of employment. So like say your company moves and it moves to another state, then you have to file an amendment of the H-1B. That sort of means like refiling it. A lot of people didn't know this in the past, so we like to mention it basically. And then obviously after the H-1B is approved, it's really important that the H-1 holder be paid the prevailing wage, the wage, as you promised on the LCA. Why? Because there are what's called site visits. The USCIS sometimes comes to companies and checks out to see whether you're being paid and whether you're actually doing the position that you said you were going to be doing. So that's important to be paid that wage and to be obviously to perform the duties that you said you were going to perform in your petition. Um, any H-1B non-immigrant has to be offered the same benefits as others that are similarly situated. So if you have the same position of a non-H-1B holder, you have to be offered the same benefits as the H-1B, uh, as the non-H-1B holder. So everyone has to be treated the same way. The other thing is the company has to have on public for public review what's called a public access file, and that basically has records about the H-1B salary and about that person, and that's something that every company has to have. And then obviously, if there are any changes, they need to be addressed by the employer. So again, I just spoke about this in a minute. Um, but basically, there are these site visits. They happen about for every 1 out of 5 applications. So it's very likely that your company will have a site visit. And they send an investigator. They don't give you notice, and they just kind of show up, and they want to see the company, and they want to see the H-1B holder, and they want to see whether that person is actually working, whether that person is being paid what they're supposed to be paid, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why it's really important to be honest on what for these things. And if you aren't, well, what happens is your H-1B can be revoked, and your company can be fined. Like here, we had one case where we didn't handle this case personally, but it was big news that one company was fined $34 million last year for penalties as a result of H-1B violations. So it's not something that any company wants to do. And the violations, they come from people that complain mostly, sometimes random audits, sometimes if you have an issue with the State Department. So in other words, sometimes if someone gets an H-1B and they go to get a visa stamp. So what happens is when you get an H-1B, and if you travel, you need to get a visa stamp in a consulate, usually in your country of origin, and you have an interview. And at that interview, you have to be able to prove that whatever is in the H-1B application is true and that there's no fraud. But if they found fraud or they found an issue, then they could refer the case back to the Department of Labor, and then the Department of Labor can initiate an audit, and that's kind of an unpleasant thing. So if they do audit, then the consequences include back wages to an H-1B employee that wasn't paid, any fees that were paid by employees, money penalties, and debarment. So they can't use the H-1B program. That happens sometimes. So there's lots of different things that can happen in the H-1B context. It's really important also, and I guess this is not part of our presentation this time, but I will speak briefly about some of the other visas that are available if you don't get an H-1B. The honest answer is there are not a lot. We usually talk about O1s. Some people may qualify for an O1, but generally you have to be sort of at the top of your field. We see a lot of people that are interested in O1s, but the O1 is a visa that is hard to get unless you have a really solid background in a specific field and that you can prove that you're the top of the field. So there are a bunch of criteria that we have for the O1. We do have people from your school from time to time that wish to apply for an O1, and we're always happy to talk to them, but they're very case specific. And what you need to remember about an O1 is you have to have professional experience, and you have to have awards, and you have to have things written about you generally, and you have to have done something that really shows that you're above most people in your area of expertise. The other visa that we see a lot of when people can't get H-1Bs are TNs. So if there's anyone here that is Mexican or Canadian, and you can get a TN, definitely go for the TN versus an H1 because there's no quota for the TN. There are a list of jobs basically for the TN that are available if you have a degree that's related to the job, and if that job is shows up on the TN um, a list of positions that are open for the TN. Um, it's less costly to get a TN. You get it for 3 years. You can apply at the border. But the only problem is that if your position isn't on that TN list, then you can't get a TN. And obviously, you still need a sponsor, and you still need to qualify for the TN with usually a bachelor's degree um, in the area that's associated with the job. Um, so that basically covers what I have to say for the H-1Bs. I'll open up the floor to questions. If anyone has any questions, we have about 12 people listening on our webinar today. So if anyone has any questions with respect to what I've said so far, they can send them on the webinar. Or if anyone sitting in the room there has any questions, you can feel free to ask me. Does anyone have any questions?
I don't see any questions from. Oh wait, there's one question from the room, David.
Hi. So if the H-1B, it's for 3 years, right? In those 3 years, if you change jobs, what happens?
So the H-1B is actually that's a really good thing if you change jobs if you have an H-1B, because even though you have to apply for another one, you can start working immediately upon filing of a new petition. So you can change jobs as many times as you'd like, as long as the new job requires is a specialty occupation, meaning that it requires a bachelor's degree and that you have that degree. And basically, you would file for that position with the USCIS the same way you apply the first time, but you can change jobs within those 6 years, however many times as you'd like.
So then the fee is applied again and everything with that, like the waiting period and the fees and the whole process?
So you have to start. So the process is exactly the same. It doesn't get any easier because it's a new employer. But that being said, the wait time is less because you don't have to worry about the cap, and you can start working as soon as the application is received by the government.
Okay, and then the 3 years start counting again, right? So
It
it kind of
starts so
extends.
so 3 years. You get 3 years every time that you apply, up to a total of 6 years. But if you've already used, say, 4 years, you're only going to get 2 years.
Right. Okay.
Okay. We
Thank
have
you.
a question from the webinar. The question is, when do you apply if you're on OPT and want to apply for a TN visa? Well, basically, because there's no quota for a TN, you can apply anytime. My recommendation is apply, 2 3 months before the expiration of your OPT. Maybe 2 months. That's enough time. So I hope that answers your question. The person who was asked by a webinar.
We have another question in the room, David.
Yes.
Can O visa and H-1B apply simultaneously, or either like after H-1B, if I don't get it, like I can immediately apply for O1? Like, is there any way?
Yes, we have a number of clients that do that actually. You can apply for an H-1B first, and if you're selected, you can then apply for an O-1, or you can apply for an O-1 first, and then it doesn't matter. You cannot have two visas at the same time. So if you get an O-1, you probably want to withdraw your H-1B because an O-1 is generally a better visa to have. Um, if there are less restrictions on it. So I would say that if you're kind of a borderline O1 case, then maybe apply for the H1, see what happens, and then go for the O1. That we do that sometimes actually for people.
And within the duration of like our OPT, like since like graduation, would we have like enough time to figure out if I didn't take H1B so I can do like O1, or is it kind of like time restricted?
Well, right now it would probably be impossible. You would have to apply for an H1 within a week. There's only one time of year when you can apply for an H1B. It's April 1st. So I can't really answer your question because I don't know when you would be applying for either one. But you just have to keep in mind that you need a month or so to apply for an H1B and more time to apply for an O1 because there's a lot more involved.
So then, are there deadlines for the O1? Kind of like April.
O1 anytime is fine. There's no deadlines. We have a question from the webinar. For the TN visa, I would like to clarify that it is for 3 years. That is correct, it is for 3 years. Do I have to apply every time you change jobs? Yes. You have to reapply. You would go to the border with a new job letter. You do need a sponsor. There's no self-employment for a TN. And the employer needs to basically give you a job offer on the letter and submit information sometimes about the company, and then you need to bring your diploma and your transcript to the border with the letter from the employer and with any other information that the employer would deem necessary, or if you're using a lawyer, the lawyer would be able to tell you exactly what you need. But it's basically a letter. That's the main thing for a TN, and your transcripts as well. Okay.
We have another question from the room.
Yes.
Yes, I wanted to know what are the chances of getting the H1B visa if you just graduated from an associate's degree?
What are the chances of getting an H1B?
Yeah.
If you just graduated with an associate's degree.
Oh, right. So, right. So I'm sorry. I should have gone over that. It's an excellent question. So there's a 3-for-1 rule. Basically, if you have only an associate's degree, you have to show the equivalent in work experience. And the work experience basically means that for every year that you're lacking towards the bachelor's degree, you need at least 3 years of work experience. So if you have an associate's degree, you have to show 6 years of work experience in the area where you're going to be working, in the specific field that you're going to be working.
We have another question.
Mm-hmm.
Can the sponsoring company be based outside the US but has a branch here, and obviously the job would be here, but it's just registered not in the US?
The company has to be a U.S. company. Many U.S. companies have parent companies or affiliates abroad. If it exists in the U.S., if it's a branch and it's duly registered in the U.S. as a branch, then yes, it would qualify for an H-1B because it's a U.S. company. A U.S. company is defined as a company that is registered in the United States. Okay,
that's it in terms of questions from the room, David.
Okay, so yeah, I have everyone else. I think I've answered all the questions on the webinar as well. I'd just like to thank all of you for coming in today. I'm sorry that we started a bit late. We do have a survey for you to fill out if you would like to fill that out, to give us some information about how you felt about today's webinar, as well as you can sign up for one of our, you can sign up for our newsletter, which we send out about once a month, that gives you updates on immigration law. And that's a free newsletter which we send to anyone who is interested in receiving that. So if you want to put down your uh, email address, we'll be happy to add you to our email server list, and you'll be able to receive that newsletter. Finally, if you do have any questions, in addition to uh, obviously you can email me. My email address is on the screen there for all of you to see. You can email Lisa, who is sitting there, Tom, who is also sitting there. Anyone obviously can ask any questions. Generally, our rule is for the students, we try to give you, an initial answer without charging you. But if we need to see you, or if you needed to have a consultation with us, then we charge $200 for a consultation. And that's basically usually, we either see you in person or we can do like a video conference like this with you and myself usually, and we talk about your case and answer any questions that you have. And we're happy to do that for anyone. And again, if it's a simple question, you can feel free to email us and we'll try to answer it. So thank you very much for attending, all of you. For those on the webinar, thank you very much. Today's webinar was recorded, and I will put it up on YouTube. So anyone who wants to see it will also be able to view it on YouTube as well.